Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of PostGame as we take the sermon from the day, the week of, and we dive deeper, we explore more. We take some of the things that one of the preachers said and we unpack it for the sake of our ongoing discipleship and further opportunity to grow in our relationship with Christ. Well, Rambo, we've got a new format that we're going to continue to explore over the next few weeks. Tell us about that.
That's right, we do, Colby Cuevas. We listen to feedback from folks, and one of the things people have told us is the best time for them to listen to it seems to be when they're in the car, when they're traveling, maybe on their way to work, or running from one place to another. And so we are going to focus more on an audio version, and so that the conversation doesn't have to feel quite as limited as us recording on a Sunday morning between services. And so we hope you find this to be helpful, as Colby said, in your ongoing discipleship as we continue to talk about the things that God is inviting us to study and consider together as a community of faith.
Yeah, that's good for me. It's probably not as good for you. You have more of a visual presence. I have definitely more of an audio presence.
Is that how we're going to break it down?
Yeah, I've got a radio voice, and you look better than I do. So.
Well, that's very kind. That's not one of the questions we're going to discuss today.
No. But yeah, so we just finished up the first installment of a new series that we're walking through this summer called From Garden to City, where we're looking at the book of Revelation, 9 sermons covering the entire gamut from chapter 1 to 21, and diving deep in this post-game time together. So Will, you preached the first of the 9, and you did a great job, and I'm excited to kick it off by looking at some deeper questions that you maybe alluded to or highlighted in your message and some of the movements, but particularly some of the things that you said and just kind of teasing them out a little bit. So in light of that, with that being said, you basically started the series off by telling us what the book of Revelation is, particularly a vision or a revelation that the Apostle John, the beloved disciple, has. And so my first question really is, how do visions or revelations, if you will, work in our really one-on-one personal discipleship with God? And maybe a follow-up on the heels of that, do people still have visions today?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did talk about how it is a vision. That's what revelation is. The word revelation comes from a Greek word, apocalypsu, which is where we get apocalypse, which is so funny because growing up, if you had told me the word apocalypse, I just thought it meant like the ending of something.
Run,
you know,
hide,
yes.
Head to the caves.
That's right. But instead, like what we're learning is that it actually means an unveiling, taking something that was hidden and letting it be seen. And so that's what John's doing. He's taking something that has always been, he's trying to make it seen, to be visible. And as to, well, one, does that still happen today? Yeah, I think we still have visions, probably not in the same nature and character and weight and authority, of course, as John's. But in our personal discipleship, I do think we have to be open to the fact that God does communicate to us in a variety of ways. And sometimes when people ask me, you know, how do they become, it's like any other element of a connection to Christ, we become more and more comfortable. And so when people ask me, how do I grow more comfortable praying, I'm say, well, you pray. So like you pray out loud, even if you're by yourself, and you just get more comfortable with the sound of your voice. You spend more time in quiet and in silence, attuning your heart and your mind to hear God speak. I would think to some degree, if somebody's listening to this and this is not an area they've explored, I would say begin in the same way. One of the simple things I do is if I have a visual or an image that continues to show up in my mind as I read or as I pray, I just write that down and see with what frequency God might be helping me see something more clearly than I've seen it before. So when we're talking about do people have visions, I would say maybe if John has a capital V vision, then yes, there are definitely ways God still speaks to us, and maybe a lowercase version of ways we can see, not with the same weight and authority, but yes, ways we can understand more because he makes something clearer to us.
That's good. Definitely that God has created us to be in a relationship with him, and so he would use the very thing that he has created, our minds, our hearts, our personalities, to communicate in the way that he's wired us.
Yeah, and you and I were even talking right before we started recording today that if we look backwards from John's revelation, the scriptures are filled with others, from Daniel to Ezekiel to Isaiah to the book of Acts has several chapters in a row between Paul and Ananias and Peter. There's a number of these. So if we can look backwards and see God had worked that way, I think it's very fair for us to look forward from that revelation and go, God would still speak to some of his people at times as we are open to it in the same way.
Yeah, Paul even writing in the church to Corinth, talking about there was a man who was caught up in the third heaven and had these visions.
Yeah.
And but there are things that are just too hard to speak in regular language, like we're talking right now, that need some sort of imagery or picture to describe it. And even if we come up with those words to describe those images and pictures, they still fall short.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And I think that's what Paul's trying to do there in the letter to the Corinthians. He's trying to explain something that's unexplainable. And we said last Wednesday and kind of the first night of walking through and then Sunday morning, and we'll keep saying it, is that's what John's trying to do. He uses simile and metaphor because he's trying to explain something he can't fully comprehend and take in that he's getting to see.
That's great. Well, let's get into a little bit more of the heart of your message. The opening question that you presented or that you laid before us to wrestle with was, what do we underestimate that has far more value than all these kind of other aspects of life that we overestimate, or put more stock in? And then you really laid it out real clearly in the message where you invite us to consider, do we underestimate Jesus? Do we underestimate the person, the work of Jesus?
Yeah.
And so my question is, how do we do that? How do we, because it seemed that the answer was implied, yes, we do in the Southern Bible Belt culture that we live in, that we underestimate Jesus, or we have the tendency, proclivity to. How do we do that? How do we underestimate who Jesus is?
I think in our culture, we have too often seen Jesus as similar to a spiritual version of 911. You call in case of emergency, rather than seeing his desire for ongoing relationship that transforms us more into his likeness. Jesus is not a part of the service industry for me. Jesus doesn't just bend at my beck and call. But I do think in my own life, and in 22 years of trying to seriously walk with Jesus, I still have fallen into that pattern of seeing Jesus as a commodity, my relationship with him as a commodity. But I think what we tried to do as we looked at this text is to see the truth of who Jesus is for John so much more overwhelming than 3 years of experience he had had with Jesus in the flesh, that John can scarcely take in all that he is being allowed to see. The weight and the gravity and the might and the power and the beauty of who Jesus really is. And one of the things that's really stuck in my mind, even in preparation and in us talking about it this week, and in this moment when we're together, Colby, is I do think I've spent a lot of my time talking about Jesus almost like he's my buddy or my pal. But there is a differentiation about the character and nature of Jesus. And the more we are open to that and rightly see him as he is, the more we recognize the work he needs to do in our life, continue to allow to be done in our life, that we can be made to be more like him.
Yeah, I think that that question in and of itself is convicting, in that the answer is yes for most people, myself included, that we underestimate Jesus. Not so much as earthly human nature as he has revealed himself to us through the New Testament, but more so maybe from his divine nature, as he's revealed all throughout Scripture. And certainly how John seems to experience him as one who he falls like as one dead.
As if I were dead.
Falls down before him. And so I remember reading a book in seminary called The Idea of the Holy, written by a guy named Rudolf Otto. And it always brings me back to that book when we start talking about this idea of holiness in the church and in theology and Scripture. And when we, human, earthly creatures see the divine God and get a grasp, just a small sliver of his nature, of his beauty, of his grandeur, of his power, that holiness is not so much an ethical or a moral, beck and call, and a really high bar of perfection that none of us can live up to, but rather God's holiness is a a communication of his power.
Yeah.
Right? A communication of how he has, in one breath, in one word, spoke everything into being.
Yeah.
Like you referenced the planets and the stars, how he
Yeah.
holds them all in his hands. And yet, we can be in a relationship with God.
Yeah, I love that thought. We talk a lot here about the connection between holiness, which is a word that, with me having and you having some church background, are familiar with, but then the idea of wholeness, WHOLE, and how much those are actually synchronized, that it's more than behavior modification to be made holy. It's actually becoming the version of us that Christ has always known us to be. And when you talk about that, underestimate his power, and I just wonder, even as people are listening right now, how many of us have aspects of our life we have just accepted that it will always be this way because we have underestimated that Christ might actually set us free from the things that entangle us. We've tried to make it behavior modification, like you were talking about, that we've got to get up to that bar. It is, because I can put the onus on me rather than learning instead to rest more and being available more for him to do work on me rather than me trying to work on it myself. So
yeah. Well, I feel like we could, and we may come back to this, and I feel like we could go on with this particular point, but I want to move on just for the sake of time. So
sure.
Another part of your sermon that really spoke to me personally was when, after John has this experience and the way he responds to this image of Jesus and all of his, grandeur, with the white hair, the flaming eyes, the double-edged sword mouth, all these things, his response is to fall over as if he were dead. The very next thing that Jesus does is what? Reaches out and touches him.
Yeah.
And the very first words that Jesus says to him are, "Do not be afraid." And so my question is, with so many people, when you talk to them, whether they're believers or not, churchgoers or not, I'd be willing to say that one of the first things that they have as far as their preconceived notion or expectation of God is this idea of fear. That God's going to smite me, that God's out watching me, looking for me, make sure I'm doing right.
Yeah.
And if I take one misstep, then boom, there comes the lightning, and I can't go into the doors of the church. Do you know what happened to the church?
Right.
Well, P.S. everybody, I'm here, and Will's here, so you're good. So does fear have a place in our relationship with God? And if so, where? And I've got a follow-up question after that.
Sure. So, quick story from my childhood is my brother used to say, when you'd sing Christmas songs and you'd go, "You better watch out, you better not cry, you better not pout, I'm telling you why." And we would sing, my brother would go, "Santa and Jesus sound so much alike." Like that's the way, because that's that viewing of like he's looking out for me, he's looking for an opportunity not to be good to me. And I think part of it is we have to come to a place of recognizing the God who could operate that way actually chooses to look for opportunities to be gracious to us, to be kind to us instead. And I think for some of us, that's healing in and of itself. When the word fear is used in Scripture to fear God, it really means to be in awe of. And so I think it's more the recognition that God is full of power and might, able to do something about our circumstances, and yet, because of his kindness, we can approach that which should seem inapproachable. We should feel unworthy to be close, and yet his grace invites us to come closer than we've ever imagined. So for me, that's the proper balance. I never want to be casual, so I do want this place of going, God is worthy of my awe, appropriately fearing the power that is there, but I don't have to live afraid, and I think that's the difference. I think I did spend part of my life afraid of God, and I certainly know I've sat in churches who, at times, I've heard sermons that worked very hard to make sure I was afraid of God. And yet, I think as we heal from that, I think we recognize God is worthy of my awe, but his kindness means I can come close. And for me, that's the proper balance.
Well said. So the follow-up question is, if fear is not the dominant disposition of a believer, of a follower of Jesus, then maybe what would, if I could nail down one particular, not that there is necessarily one, but if I could nail down one particular dominant disposition or posture or, say, way of being in the world, what would it be for the follower of Jesus, if not fear?
I think that's such a great question, and I feel like it deserves its own podcast at some point. Like, there's a lot of ways, but as you ask it, and I think maybe my answer might be colored over the next few weeks as we unfold more of Revelation. Mm. But I think the word is reverence, because I think that's a proper way of fear. But then I also think as I have gotten to learn a lot about this book and this letter and this epistle and this revelation over the last year and a half, I think reverence always leads you to activity, because God's love and affection for us has always led him to activity. Mm-hmm. And so I think the proper place is beginning in this posture of worship and reverence. And from there, I will rise in his activity rather than continuing on in my own activity.
Interesting. Okay. I did not think you were going to answer like that. I thought you were going to go, 1 Corinthians 13, love on us, but
I like to spice it up for you once in a while, Colby.
Curveball. But I think you're right. That could deserve its own podcast, and maybe we'll start a new one. But following that, and maybe bringing some final thoughts together from this sermon, because we've got 8 more to go. So
we do.
Jesus is right there before John, and he reveals himself as being right there in the middle of these 7 churches. 7 being this picture of completion or wholeness. The 7 churches could be, a image for all of the churches throughout today's day and age, throughout history, but also today, throughout the world. So if Jesus, right there across the entire globe in the middle of the church, and even right here on North Coley Road, being in the middle of the Orchard Church, you use the phrase, our lives are in the hands of God. I've said it before at many of sermons or services that I performed, weddings at. I always give this Irish blessing to couples in my way of closing. I say, may the road rise to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, the rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. So what does that mean? What does that look like for Jesus to be in the middle, for our lives to be in the middle of his hands in the 7 churches? What does that look like? And in other places in Scripture, Paul says in Acts 17 to the people of Athens, the men of Athens, as your own poets have said, in him we live, move, and have our being. Can you tease that out a little bit more for us? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think part of the beauty of John's revelation and the language he uses is it ties together so many other threads of Scripture. And so part of what I think John is establishing by this vision, what Jesus is revealing about himself is it's this fulfilled embodiment of what he came to be when he, in Isaiah's promises and as he was born, as Emmanuel. God is with us. And I had a mentor that once told me that the most powerful verb in Scripture is that present tense in the introduction of Emmanuel, is that God is with us. And so, Colby, we talk to so many people who right now feel this weight and this fear, and as we unfold Revelation are hoping that we're going to show some map to the way and the timing, and I think if that's what we long for it to be, in that sense we will find ourselves somewhat wanting and disappointed, and yet when we see what it actually is, we find this greater encouragement to become more and more the people that God has called us to be, because he is not distant and far off. He is not detached, waiting on us to arrive, but he is near us. And so anybody who's listening to the sound of our voice today can be reminded of the same promise you and I have as we sit here and record it, and that is whatever you and I walked in with today, he's with us in the midst of it. And that whatever, as somebody is listening, as they're driving down the road and they're thinking, but you don't know, like the bills that need to be paid and the things, and you don't know the circumstance of my relationships. I don't know, but I don't have to. I'm freed up from needing to know all those things. My identity is not bound up in needing all the information. But what I hope they would hear us is this great reminder that the one who does hold in the world in his hands also holds their world in his hands. And he is not distant and far off. He's a lot closer than the sound of our voice. And for me, that is the very best of news.
Yeah, it absolutely brings a smile to my face. It is good news. I wish you guys could see this smile right now, but if not, I'll show you next time I see you in person. But until then, Will Rambo, thank you so much.
Thank you, Colby.
See us next week for another session of PostGame. Have a great week.